There are days when nothing in your world has changed. The sky is still blue, the coffee still warm, the same people speak the same words, and yet something inside you no longer fits. You go through the motions, you smile when expected, but beneath it all, there's a silence that wasn't there before. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that unsettles, like a question without shape, quietly blooming in the chest. Have you felt it? That strange disconnection from your own reflection. That sense that the person everyone sees, the reliable one, the strong one, the smiling one, might no longer be you. It's not sadness exactly. It's not fatigue. It's something deeper, like a soul slowly peeling away from the life it once agreed to. I used to think something was wrong with me when this feeling came. I tried to fix it with new routines, louder laughter, longer to-do lists. But the stillness only grew louder until I stopped running, until I sat down one evening beside the feeling and listened. That's when I remembered a line from the Dhammapada: all conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. Maybe, just maybe, this ache isn't a mistake. Maybe it's an invitation. In this video, I want to walk with you through 7 quiet signs that your soul is awakening, not breaking down. I'll share stories, old Zen parables, and new lives unraveling with grace that remind us when life feels like it no longer fits. It doesn't mean we're lost. It means we're being found. Let's begin. Part 1. The Unseen Beginning. Why do things that once lit us up now leave us unmoved? There comes a moment, often quiet, unannounced, when life begins to feel like it's slipping through your fingers, even as you go through the motions. You still wake up to the same alarm, drink your morning tea, water the garden, and nod at the neighbor who always walks his dog at 7:15. But something is off, not on the surface. Inside, you feel like a guest in your own life, wearing a smile that doesn't quite fit, performing roles that once mattered, but now somehow feel borrowed. It's not dramatic. There's no thunderstorm or midlife meltdown. It's more like the fading warmth of sunlight after dusk. The light is still there, but it no longer warms your skin. What if this emptiness isn't a sign that something's broken? What if it's a signal that something deeper is stirring? The Buddha once said, "Just as a candle cannot burn without fire, men cannot live without a spiritual life." And perhaps that fire within you has not gone out, but changed form. What you're feeling may not be confusion, but invitation, an invitation to begin again. There is a Zen story of a man who visited a master in search of enlightenment. As the tea was being served, the master poured into the guest's cup until it overflowed. Alarmed, the man shouted, "It's full, no more will go in." The master looked at him and gently replied, "Just like this cup, you are full of your own opinions and assumptions. How can I show you Zen unless you first empty your cup?" Perhaps that's where you are now. The things that once filled you no longer fit, not because you failed, but because you've outgrown them. Like old shoes that once carried you faithfully, but now pinch your feet and make each step uneasy. Life, in its quiet wisdom, is gently asking you to take them off. A woman I once knew, let's call her Mara, had spent most of her life taking care of others. A mother, a teacher, a giver in every sense. But one morning, as she sat at the edge of her bed, watching sunlight slide across the floor, she felt like a stranger in her own story. Not sad, not angry, just hollow, as if something had quietly walked out of her life and left no note. She tried to brush it off. Maybe it's just exhaustion, she told herself, but the feeling stayed. Days passed, then weeks, and finally, one evening, while folding laundry, She whispered a question that had been living silently in her chest for years. Is this really who I am, or just who I've been trained to be? That question, simple and soft as it was, changed everything. Not all at once, of course. There was no dramatic exit, no upheaval, but a door inside her had creaked open. She began to notice her breath more often. She spent longer sitting on her porch. She lit candles for no reason. She listened, not to fix, but to feel. So let me ask you, have you ever felt that strange, weightless distance between what you do and who you are? Have you ever smiled while feeling invisible inside your own skin? Don't rush to fix it. Don't run from the quiet. The Buddha taught, peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. What you're experiencing may not be a breakdown, but a sacred unraveling. The old self, dutiful, busy, well-rehearsed, is loosening its grip, making space for something more honest, more whole. And this is only the beginning. Because once that silence settles in, another question begins to emerge. If I no longer find joy in what I used to, then what now is calling me? But we're not quite there yet. First, let's sit a little longer in this threshold, the space where the past no longer fits, and the future hasn't yet revealed itself. Shall we walk deeper? Part 2. The pull inward. What if feeling lost is exactly how the soul finds its way? It begins quietly. A tug you can't explain. A soft pressure behind your ribs when you're supposed to be fine. You're sitting at the dinner table, smiling across from people who love you, yet something inside aches like an unanswered call. You try to name it. Maybe it's fatigue, or too much on your mind. But deep down you know, this isn't about stress. It's about misalignment. The life around you no longer matches the life within you. The Buddha once said, nothing ever exists entirely alone. Everything is in relation to everything else. And when your outer world no longer reflects your inner truth, the soul begins to call you inward, to recalibrate the connection between who you are and how you live. There's a Zen tale of a young monk who approached his master with frustration. I've been meditating, working, praying, but I still feel empty. The master nodded, poured him a bowl of water, and handed him a spoonful of salt. Stir this in and drink, he said. The monk did, and winced. Now come with me, said the master, leading him to a lake nearby. Now stir the same salt into this lake, and drink. The monk did, and smiled. I don't taste it anymore. The master looked at him and said, the suffering is the same, but you must expand your container. This is the stage of expansion. You feel pulled inward not to escape life, but to find the lake within you, deeper, quieter, more spacious than the surface rolls you've outgrown. When everything outside feels tight or noisy, the soul retreats into silence, not to disappear, but to heal. I once spoke with an older man, let's call him Thomas, who spent 4 decades building a life around duty, a proud father, husband and business owner. But after retirement, he found himself waking each morning to silence that no longer felt like rest. He thought he missed his work, but slowly he realized he missed purpose, not productivity, meaning. He began walking alone at dawn, not for exercise but for stillness. One morning he paused beneath a tree, and a single leaf floated down into his open palm. It felt like the world was handing me something, he told me, like a reminder that even in stillness something is always moving. I just hadn't learned how to listen, and perhaps that's where many of us find ourselves, somewhere between the noise we once lived by and the silence we now need. But silence can be unsettling when you're used to chasing. Stillness can feel like failure when your worth has always been measured in motion. So, let me ask you gently, Have you mistaken quiet for emptiness? Have you mistaken stillness for stagnation? In Buddhist practice, the retreat into silence is not an escape. It's a return to presence, to breath, to what's true when no one is watching. The Buddha taught, just as a solid rock is not shaken by the storm, even so the wise are not affected by praise or blame. That kind of steadiness isn't found by running faster. It's cultivated in stillness. You may feel the urge to fix this phase, to find a new project, a new label, a new urgency. But what if you let yourself fall inward instead? What if you allowed this chapter to be what it is? A sacred pause, not a detour. Because here's the quiet truth. What looks like falling apart may actually be falling into place. But of course, as we go deeper, another discomfort arises. What do you do when the life you've built begins to feel like someone else's story? That's where we'll go next. Part 3. The quiet collapse of the old self. What if the person you've been is just the shell of who you're meant to become? It doesn't happen all at once. There's no loud unraveling, no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet drifting. You look in the mirror, and the eyes looking back feel distant, familiar, but hollow. The smile you wear still lifts your cheeks, but it doesn't rise from within. The things that once defined you, your title, your calendar, your relationships, suddenly feel like costumes in a play that no longer fits your soul. In the teachings of the Buddha, there is a word, anatta, no fixed self. It is the radical invitation to understand that the self is not a solid object, but a flowing process. We are not what we accumulate. We are not our roles. And when the time comes, those roles must fall away like autumn leaves, not because they were false, but because they were temporary. There's a Zen story that speaks to this moment. A monk, known for his knowledge and strict discipline, approached a hermit master. "I have studied all the sutras," he said proudly, "and followed every rule." The hermit simply asked, "And who are you when you take off your robes?" The monk stood frozen. He had no answer. That's what happens when the old self begins to collapse. Not because of failure, but because it can no longer hold the truth trying to rise within you. The scaffolding around your identity starts to crack, not to destroy you, but to reveal the space beyond the structure. I remember speaking with a woman, let's call her Evelyn, who had always been the reliable one in her family. She cooked, she cleaned, she showed up to every birthday, every emergency. But when her children moved away and her husband passed, she was left in a house full of silence and no idea who she was without someone to serve. "It felt like I was disappearing," she whispered. But then slowly I realized I was finally appearing. Beneath all the roles and responsibilities, there was a quiet, curious self I'd forgotten. She started painting again, something she hadn't done since her 20s. Not to sell, not to show, just to feel her own presence again. It was like my soul had been waiting in the attic all these years. She laughed through tears. This is not uncommon. The collapse of identity feels terrifying because we mistake it for death. But as the Buddha taught, just as a snake sheds its skin, we must shed our past over and over again. We fear the loss, but that very loss is the gateway to authenticity. So if you find yourself saying things like, "I don't know who I am anymore, let me offer a different lens," maybe you're not losing yourself. Maybe you're shedding the layers that were never truly you. Pause with that, breathe with it. This unraveling, uncomfortable as it is not evidence of weakness. It is the sign that you've outgrown the mask, and something deeper is asking to be seen. But of course, the mind resists. The ego protests. It wants to know, to fix, to return to the safety of identity. Yet beneath all that noise is a quiet voice asking, what if you let go? What might you discover beneath the mask? In the next part of our journey, we'll sit with that very question. Part 4. The ache of misalignment. When your life no longer fits, what if the life you built with such care no longer has room for the person you're becoming? There is a peculiar ache that arises, not from pain, but from misalignment. It creeps in softly, in the quiet of familiar routines. You go to the same job, speak with the same people, sit in the same chair, sipping the same tea, and yet something feels off. The colors seem duller, the conversations more distant. Even joy feels like it's passing through you instead of coming from within. And this is where the suffering begins, not from some external crisis, but from a life that no longer mirrors the truth blooming inside you. The Buddha once said, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." But how many of us fill our days with hollow rituals, hollow smiles, hollow duties? There's a modern parable of a teacher who, after decades of service, found herself growing restless. Her students adored her. Her classroom was bright with art and laughter. But somewhere in her, a silence began to grow. Not sadness, not burnout, just silence. A space where meaning used to live. She stopped finding delight in the alphabet songs and the bulletin board decorations. She began longing, not for rest, but for realness. She told me once, "I didn't stop loving the children. I just stopped pretending that the stories I was reading to them spoke to me." So she began to write her own stories, ones that carried the quiet complexities of healing, loss, and wonder. And though she didn't abandon her classroom, she shifted. She began reading stories that asked deeper questions, stories that stirred something not just in her students, but in herself. Slowly, her life began to reflect her truth again. This is the subtle power of misalignment. It doesn't scream, it hums. And if we don't listen, it becomes a weight that steals our vitality and robs us of our aliveness. There's a Zen koan that says, "The wind does not break the tree breaks itself when it refuses to bend." Often misalignment is not a result of catastrophe, but of refusal. Refusal to bend when the soul is asking for space. Refusal to question what no longer fits. Refusal to grieve the version of ourselves that once needed those routines. You may feel this now, a soft pull to be alone, to withdraw, to stop saying yes to things that used to light you up. You may find yourself seeking silence instead of conversation, longing for slowness instead of stimulation. These are not signs of failure. They are the whispers of your deeper self, asking, can we live more honestly now? But here's the catch. This honesty often requires loss. You may lose approval. You may lose the identity that once gave you direction. You may lose momentum in exchange for stillness. Are you ready for that? Are you ready to trade comfort for clarity? Because when we no longer fit inside our own life, it's not time to shrink, it's time to reshape. And that's the beauty hidden in misalignment. It reveals where truth is trying to break through. In the next part of our journey, we'll explore that quiet moment of reckoning, the sacred disintegration of ego, and how it is not the end, but the beginning. Part 5. The sacred disintegration. What falls away is not lost. What if what feels like falling apart is actually falling open? There comes a moment when the scaffolding you've built around yourself, your routines, your roles, your reputation, begins to tremble. It doesn't collapse suddenly like a tower struck by lightning. No, it loosens gently, like threads coming undone, one quiet unraveling at a time. You say no to something you used to say yes to. You cancel a plan and feel relief, not guilt. You start pausing before you respond. And in that pause, something shifts, and then it hits you. I don't want to be this version of myself anymore. Not because it was wrong, but because it's no longer true. The Buddha once said, just as a snake sheds its skin, we must shed our past over and over again. But here's what the teachings don't always say. Shedding is not neat. It's not always peaceful. Sometimes it feels like dying, quietly, privately. You mourn not a person, not a place, but a version of yourself that once carried you through the world. And that kind of mourning is hard to name. There is a Zen story of a monk who approached his teacher and said, "Master, I feel like I'm falling apart." The teacher simply smiled and replied, "Good. Now you can see what was never truly you. What wisdom, and yet what disorientation. Because when ego loosens, there's no immediate celebration. There is confusion. There is vulnerability. There is grief. You may find yourself crying without cause, laughing at things that used to frustrate you, feeling tender in moments that once made you numb. These are not breakdowns. They are breakthroughs dressed in strange clothing. In this sacred disintegration, you may find your relationship shifting. Some people may fade from your life, not because of conflict, but because your frequency no longer matches theirs. Old desires lose their shine. The goals that used to motivate you now feel distant, hollow. You might even feel like a stranger in your own home, your own body, and that's okay. Because when the ego disintegrates, the soul starts speaking more clearly, not in words but in sensation. A pull in the chest, a soft ache in the belly, a knowing that you can't unknow. But be gentle here. The ego isn't an enemy. It protected you. It helped you survive. It made sense of a complicated world. And now, it's simply time for it to soften, to make space for something more spacious, more real. Nothing ever exists entirely alone. Everything is in relation to everything else. The Buddha. This unraveling isn't isolated. It's part of the dance of impermanence. You are not breaking. You are returning, bit by bit, to your original wholeness. So ask yourself, what mask is ready to fall? What identity have you outgrown, but still cling to out of fear? What part of you longs to be seen without needing to perform? It may feel scary to let go, but what if what's falling away was never truly yours? And what if what's rising is not new, but eternal? In the next part, we will follow this thread even deeper into the realm of stillness, of silence, of the space where truth finally begins to whisper. The moment when your soul no longer shouts to be heard, because you've finally begun to listen. Part 6, the quiet voice within. When you finally begin to listen, what if your most sacred teacher has been whispering all along, and you were just too loud to hear it? There comes a time, not with fireworks, but with silence, when the world grows so noisy that your soul no longer tries to shout over it. Instead, it waits, quietly, patiently, in the stillness between your thoughts, in the breath you forgot to notice, in the ache behind your smile. You don't arrive here by choice. Not exactly. You arrive because something else stopped working. The pushing, the proving, the endless doing, they all led you here, this strange space where silence no longer feels empty, but sacred. There's a Buddhist parable of a student who asked the master, "When will I hear the voice of wisdom?" The master replied, "When you stop answering every question before it finishes asking itself." It's not that the voice wasn't there, it's that we were drowning it out, with distractions, with performance, with our addiction to noise. In modern life, stillness is often misunderstood. It's labeled as laziness, as weakness, as something to fill. But in the teachings of the Buddha, silence is not the absence of something. It is the presence of awareness, as the Dhammapada reminds us. Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace. And those words, the real ones, they rise in silence. You begin to notice this the moment you stop chasing answers. You start asking better questions instead. What do I feel when I stop trying to fix everything? What remains when there is nothing left to distract me? These are not questions of the mind. They are invitations of the heart. Let me tell you a story. There was once a woman who spent decades of her life succeeding on paper. She had the degrees, the title, the admiration. But one day, she walked into her apartment after a long meeting, dropped her keys, and sat on the floor, not because she was tired, but because something inside her whispered, "Enough." For the first time, she didn't turn on the TV. She didn't scroll her phone. She just sat. And in that unfamiliar silence, she wept, not from sadness, but from recognition. The voice within her hadn't gone silent. She had simply forgotten how to hear it. Sometimes it begins like that. No grand event, no retreat in the mountains, just a quiet moment in the middle of an ordinary day. And in that moment, you hear it, not as a command, not as a judgment, but as a presence, a knowing. You are safe now. You no longer need to pretend. And that voice, once heard, begins to guide you, not with certainty, but with clarity, not with maps, but with feeling. It says, turn left here, not because it makes sense, but because it aligns with something ancient within you. That's how the Buddha himself began, not with divine visions, but with a simple observation under the Bodhi tree, that life is suffering, and that within that suffering, a path to liberation exists. But to find it, we must be still enough to recognize the steps. So can you be still? Can you sit in a room without needing to escape yourself? Can you let the quiet speak before rushing to fill it? Because sometimes the most powerful transformation begins not when you take action, but when you learn how to listen. In the next part, we will explore what happens after you begin to hear that inner voice, when your outer life no longer matches the truth that is growing within, and you must choose to shrink back into the comfort of the known, or to step into the unknown, where your soul is waiting. Part 7. The Pathless Path. When you start living from within, what if the map you were following was never meant to lead you home? There comes a quiet shift. At first, it's barely noticeable, a hesitation before you say yes, a sudden disinterest in things that used to thrill you, an odd longing for silence, even in moments of joy, and then it deepens. You start to realize something profoundly unsettling. The life you've built no longer feels like it belongs to you. You wake up one morning and go through the motions, make the coffee, answer the emails, smile politely at familiar faces. But a question lingers in the back of your mind, like a slow-burning candle. If none of this defined me, who would I be? It's a terrifying and holy question. And as the Buddha taught, no one saves us but ourselves. No one can, and no one may. We ourselves must walk the path. But what he didn't say, at least not in words, is that the path he spoke of often doesn't look like a path at all. It isn't paved. It isn't linear. It doesn't follow the rules the world taught you to obey. This is the pathless path. There's a Zen story of a monk who traveled for years searching for the truth. He read scriptures, debated sages, sat in the deepest meditations, but peace remained distant. One day, he asked an old woman who sold rice cakes on the side of a dusty road, "Where is the path to enlightenment?" She looked at him and smiled gently. "Walk as if your feet were kissing the earth," she said, "and the path will appear." He laughed at the simplicity. But that night, he did exactly that. He walked slowly, without destination, feeling every step. And for the first time, his heart quieted. You see, it's not that we don't know the way, it's that we've been looking for it outside ourselves. When you begin living from within, the old motivations start to lose their grip. You no longer chase validation. You no longer contort yourself to fit into someone else's mold. Your decisions aren't made to impress, they're made to feel true. But this honesty comes with a price. You start losing things that once defined you. You might find friendships fading, not out of anger, but out of resonance. You might step away from a career that once felt like your identity. You might spend more time alone, not lonely, but alone with something sacred. And all the while, a voice within grows stronger, not louder, but steadier. This voice doesn't say, do more. It says, be here. It doesn't ask, what's next? It asks, what is true? And this is where the pathless path becomes clear. Not on a map, not in the approval of others, but in your breath, in your silence, in your small sacred choices, lighting a candle before bed, saying no without guilt, sitting in nature without needing to name or label it. You begin to sense what Zen calls mo, emptiness that is full, a life that's no longer built on what you can hold, but on what you can feel. You begin to trust that even without a plan, something ancient in you knows the way. So let me ask you something now. When was the last time you made a decision not because it was smart, but because it felt like home? Not because you could explain it, but because your soul whispered. This is the beginning of real freedom, but the journey doesn't stop here. In fact, the next part of the path brings you face to face with one final illusion, the belief that healing must look like perfection. In part 8, we'll explore what it really means to embody healing, to stop performing transformation and simply become it, imperfect, messy, and deeply real. Remember that strange stillness we spoke of, the quiet moment when everything familiar felt suddenly far away, that patch of silence in your day where the light fell differently and your breath paused without reason. I kept thinking about it, how something so ordinary could feel like a doorway, not to somewhere else, but to a part of ourselves we had long forgotten. And just now, while sitting here with these words, I realized something I hadn't noticed before. Maybe the path we're on isn't about becoming someone new. Maybe it's about remembering the person we were before we tried so hard to be enough. Before the world asked us to perform, to prove, to please. I think of the way autumn leaves drift to the ground, not in a hurry, not with regret, just surrendering softly to the next chapter of the season. There's no shame in shedding what no longer fits. No shame in letting go of roles, names, or masks that no longer feel alive on our skin. Some parts of us were never meant to be carried forever. They were simply scaffolding, so we could reach the place where silence feels like home again. So if you've felt a quiet stirring lately, a longing you can't name, a soft ache in your chest that no one else sees, hold it gently. Breathe with it. Walk slowly with it. You are not falling apart, you are falling inward. And if this touched something sacred in you, perhaps someone you love is walking the same invisible bridge. You could send this to them not as an answer, but as a lantern, just a small light to remind them they're not alone.